Hello, everyone, and welcome to Liam's Lyceum. I'm your host, Liam, aka Hembar, and today I want to talk about another book that I recently read that is Conquered, the Last Children of Anglo-Saxon England by Eleanor Parker. Eleanor Parker is one of probably the most useful, scholars I've ever really um, read that I find very handy and useful in a really often, like in a day-to-day sense. Mostly, this is from her stuff that she reposts online almost every day, pretty much for any day that it matters, right? So she'll do a lot of like historical stuff, festivals and whatnot throughout the year that would have been celebrated in early medieval England. Uh, but she also talked about a good amount of these in her book, which I have previously talked about, which is Winters in the World. And I've looked at this book a good amount since finishing it. So I decided to read another one of her books, which I believe came out in the same year, actually, in 2022, and that is Conquered, the Last Children of Anglo-Saxon England. I'm not sure if I will look at this one as much, like as Winters in the World has, again, this calendar effect, essentially, that it is useful whenever stuff comes up in the calendar. Conquered is very much about certain events. It is a history book, essentially, though well, it's not written like many history books I've read, and we'll get into that actually. So while most histories, English histories, I would even say, histories of England, tend to stop or start at 1066, this covers that conquest period and the first generations after. Parker has a very personal approach to the text and to this idea of history itself, bringing the reader in to this research in a sense, right, with her language skills, putting some of the examples of these medieval texts on the page. And I would say these are language skills that I would argue a lot of historians don't have. And so when you read a lot of histories, you don't get this experience. So, for example, I would say like another Anglo-Saxon history I've read, Mark Morris's. It's a very nice introduction, but it's very broad. It's like kind of like a layman's information, I would say. While this is much more specific to 1066, kind of time leading up to that and time after that, depending on who she's talking about in this cultural context and historical context. Um, it is also not as broad. I mean, it is very specific and it is very much in the text, right? And so because of that, it deals with important people. It deals with kind of movers and shakers, though in some sense, actually, it mostly is dealing with people that are absent from these texts. But since she's looking at medieval texts don't talk about your common like lower class people for this period. And that's pretty normal. So if you want that, then maybe this is not the book for you. This is very specific about talking about certain people um, in this context of the Norman conquest. And so um, I would say in parts that also because history is a mode to cultural change, and I think that really is displayed well here as you have uh, this effect essentially with this Norman conquest. This is a big change for English history, which is one of the reasons why some end here, and I would argue that many English histories begin here, putting that modern English history, in some sense, seems to begin in 1066. Though I would say that Parker illustrates rather well that is not quite the case, really. That is just a step in English history. And at this point, English history has already it's been around, it's existed for 4 centuries already at this point. Um, and so it gets into that, and then also it gets again really into the personal lives of real people, of a culture of real people from the past, um, and then rather than some aloof relating of events, right, of running through some years or some annals, right. We do get chronicles that do come in as sources, and we do get hagiography and even romance in a sense. So let's look at what this book covers because there's really only a few chapters, and it covers pretty specific things in those chapters. So um, while history is, we have all heard the saying that history is written by the victors. This is pretty much a history actually written by the losers, right? Because this is about the English, and in 1066, um, the English versus the Normans, the English lose. Okay, and so this is a history written by the losers in a sense. So one of the aspects in this book that is rather evident is the change, and that is language change. That is rather easy to tell. Um, in early medieval England, what is called Anglo-Saxon England, we have a very broad English literature. Okay, English was used to write a Latin grammar at the time. We have some of the best poetry that I've ever read: stories, translations, homilies, even the Bible. After the conquest, most texts are written in Latin and French, and it's this norm after conquest that would lead to someone like William Tyndale for what he, for getting punished for translating the Bible. Well, someone like Alfred, just a few centuries before him, before the Norman conquest, was asked to translate the Bible into English. So a very different context as far as literature and language is concerned. I think Parker puts a good effort into showing this cultural change and identity shift. The Anglo-Saxons would have called themselves English, the English having been a divinable people for a few centuries, and an idea at least since Bede. Anglo-Norman society also would have seen themselves English, probably shortly after this conquering, for they lived in England. And one thing that also becomes evident is that English society is probably not like as straightforward as many would expect, as there's kind of like an Anglo-Danish identity as well for parts of England at the time when England was conquered in 1066. So while, of course, most nobles of the Anglo-Saxons after the Norman conquest are replaced by French-speaking Normans, and some with ranking clergy, only 6%, for example, we learn, of land in England is in the hands of the English shortly after conquest, and only one English bishop would keep his see. And well, we have some stuff about English earls as well and how that played out. So pretty much you have drastic shifts in power and dynamics, right? Pretty much you have, before you had English people, and you had the English people were all states. They were in the ranks of the church. They were in the ranks of just the nobility and the royal ranks and whatnot, and just your common lower ranked people that would have made up most people, of course. And then after the Norman conquest, pretty much all those higher ranked English people are kicked out or killed in some cases, and they're replaced with Normans. And so then you have a very stratified society that is notable because that upper crust is then speaking French, and they're not speaking English really actually at all. So we do have some certain historical persons focused on, though, of course, in this book. First, actually, up is Hereward the Wake. We learn of the Finlands largely shrunken in our modern world, but as well as Ely and the Centers for Literature for Monks who wrote in English after the conquest. We also have a section on Margaret of Scotland, of the House of Wessex. Her brother Edgar Atheling was proclaimed king but never crowned after the death of Harold Godwinson. She fled to Scotland after William the Bastard became the conqueror and married Malcolm III, and she became his queen. Hence why she's called Margaret of Scotland. She was canonized shortly after her death, well, about a century and a half later, though her veneration, in a sense, seems to have been very shortly after her death. And it's through her daughter Edith, who is also called Matilda, interestingly enough, whose daughter, Edith / Matilda's daughter, would become Empress Matilda or Empress Maud of the anarchy. And so through Margaret of Scotland, the House of Wessex has actually been part still of English literature, of the English monarchy today, since 1066, pretty much after Henry I, then that every English monarch has been connected to the House of Wessex still. So there's only a couple kings even then after, well, I guess Harold Godwinson, of course. So after Edward the Confessor that were, and of course Canute the Great would not have been House of Wessex either. So pretty much House of Wessex is including pretty much every ruler of England for a period longer than 1,000 years, which is kind of nuts, even to today, like I said. So Charles III is of the House of Wessex in that sense. So this is also, there's a section on the Godwins as well, after the House of Wessex and Margaret of Scotland. Be they his wife Geetha and his descendants after Harold died at Hastings. Most actually left England, and their stories continue in Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. Though Edith, the wife of Edward the Confessor, stayed and died at Winchester in 1075, Also, Gunhild of Wessex, who eloped and was berated by Anselm of Canterbury, does show up in records. With this chapter, we really get the connections of England had at the time with Denmark and Norway, and how that was largely severed actually with the Norman conquest. And it does make you think of if Harold Hardrada had won at Stamford Bridge, maybe that would have been very different. For example, we also have Tostig, Godwinson's son, who becomes best friends with Harold Hardrada's son, Olaf, the Peaceful, who does become king, actually. And Tostig's descendants, actually, one of his descendants becomes King Inga the second, I think. And so I mentioned this in my previous video where I talked about conversion in Iceland. So it's all connected. But reality may have been very different, depending on Stamford Bridge, of course, and of Hastings, those battles in 1066. So the last section, we then have a section on Waltheof, the only martyr of the Norman conquest, which compared to the Danish conquest, which was much longer but produced many more saints, essentially, from it. We also go over Canterbury, pretty much. We have the idea of memory, particularly established of Anglo-Saxon England by Admar of Canterbury, who was an English Benedictine monk, who would have been rather young during the Norman conquest, but did remember the stuff. In particular, actually, as Canterbury, that Anglo-Saxon cathedral of Canterbury was destroyed in December of 1066 to 1067, so only a year after the Norman conquest. And this was a heavy blow, in a sense, to morale, but also kind of a sign of the end of Anglo-Saxon England. And it was later rebuilt very shortly after by the Normans. And we do get parts of Anselm, of course, and Lanfranc of Pavia in this as well. So overall, I would say this book is a great exploration of one of the first great traumas of England as a whole, right? I mean, in fact, you have an earlier great trauma, but in that trauma is what forged England, and that is Viking incursions, right? These armies from Scandinavians absolutely destroying a lot of English stuff before it's really particularly English, right? And then you have the House of Wessex getting dominion over the English through this. And so that kind of forged the nation itself. And then you have this Norman conquest, which is a big, big change in history. And it is an important piece as English itself. The language has changed so much, in no small part due to the conquest, that many English speakers, in a sense, I would even say comparable, that many English speakers don't know some of this history, can't read stuff like Anglo-Saxon texts because of this conquest, right? If you go to Iceland today, Icelanders read these Old Norse sagas, and they know them. That is their history, and you could argue maybe that there's less that's happened in Iceland. You're probably right than has happened in England since then. But English has had a lot more French words. 85% of the lexicon of Old English does not survive in modern English. Now you can say that of the 100 most common words in English, 95% of those are Germanic. And 90% of them are probably from Old English specifically. The other 5% I'd say are maybe, I'd wager from Old Norse, though we do get some Germanic words actually through French from Frankish, but that is not a big point here. So I would say actually though that again that it I don't know, I'm not English actually, so I don't know how the English so much do this time in history, but I assume they go over it. I did not go over this in my schooling. So well, my schooling when I was younger, right, that everyone would go through. I just learned this myself. So, but I think there is a stark chord that Parker strikes when she says there are no romances, essentially, of these English characters. Okay, Edgar never regained his right, and romances end with that trope essentially being fulfilled. And so, so no romance could be written of these English characters in a sense. And so that is a chapter in English history. It's not the beginning, but nor is it the end of English history. One thing I also think that is worth mentioning, I think it's rather common knowledge that a group of English people, a large portion of English people actually, went to Byzantium to fight in the Varangian Guard. And some, though, it's probably not common knowledge, some actually were able to win a new home for themselves, and this became a colony called New England. It's only mentioned in a couple sources, and neither of them are English, though there's a good chance these sources are based off an English source that's lost, I would wager. Um, and it's called New England. It's in Crimea. And in fact, that there is a place name um, evidence in Crimea that a place named after York and a place named after London. Um, from these English speakers that would have settled there. And I believe I've even seen some linguistic evidence that Gothic also survived in Crimea for centuries, like 1,000 years after the Goths left, which is nuts. But there's actually some evidence in that small sampling of Crimean Gothic that it actually has some West Germanic influence in it, and it might be from these English settlers having contact with these Goths in Crimea. So very interesting stuff going on there. Also, very fun to think about and know, I think. So before the New England, there is rather in the United States, there was a earlier New England, and it was in Crimea, and it was for kind of sad reasons that it came into existence. People who wanted a home where they felt like they could freely be English, um, couldn't do that in England at the time. They no longer had their home. So, anyways, hope that is as interesting to you as it was to me. It was a great read. Liam from Liam's Lyceum. I'll catch you next time.